All right, I want to share with you something today that I find incredibly interesting. I have been looking at it for the last few weeks, the last few months actually, and it sort of came to me unusually in that I was sitting before a sermon, before a trip out to Kyogle. They'd asked me to preach, and it was a big week. It had been a big month, and I had nothing. I was dry, emotionally dry, theologically dry, everything dry. And yeah, so it just sort of happened upon me. I found some of the stuff interesting based on the Sabbath school that we did last. And I started reading about it, but sort of left it as you do. Life kind of piled up. And so God was very good to me in that I was dry, and then I prayed, and things just started falling into place. Not as a scientist that I like necessarily supernatural explanations for things, but I had nothing, and then at the end I came up with something that I think is very much inspired. Not that I came up with it, I just found things that happened to be quite interesting. It is a bit of a longer one. I'll try not to rush through it because there are lots of interesting things in it, but also I'll try not to take too much of your time either. So, what we shall do today, it's going to be a case study on Nebuchadnezzar, so the story of Nebuchadnezzar. And my question for you is today, that I'd like to lead with, is something that we've all asked at some stage in our lives, and that would be, well, if you got to heaven, what are some of the first questions you'd ask in heaven? You know, we like asking that as Christians. What are some of the religious people in general? What are some of the first questions you would ask God when you are to stand before Him? Some of the first things. And one of the prolific things, or at least one of the first things that I perhaps would ask would be, okay, show me, God, what you had planned, or where are parts of my life, dear Lord, where you spoke to me and I was just too oblivious to listen. I was doing my own thing, or we were talking today about healing, and Pastor Doug talked about suffering today, and not being so involved with your own suffering that you can't see those of each other, those of other people, and that's something that came out in our Sabbath school as well. And that's the question I'd like to lead in with today, is that I'd like to take a look at Nebuchadnezzar in his life and see how God spoke to Nebuchadnezzar and tried prompting, and how he tried speaking to him. And what the result or what the effect of that was. And that's something that we can learn from, and hopefully we can take some lessons away from it as we go through our sermon today. So I'd invite you to bow your heads, and we'll invite God's presence to us. Dear Lord God, I'd like to praise you, dear Lord, this morning for your goodness and your righteousness. I'd like to thank you for giving us another week. And I'd like to ask, dear Lord, that you bless us as we look to learn more about you. Ask in your name. Amen. Okay, so Nebuchadnezzar. What I'm going to do first is take a look at what Nebuchadnezzar, so the historical side of Nebuchadnezzar, because we've got two stories that happen concurrently, that happen at the same time. We've got the historical story, so secular history, and then we've got the biblical history. So we have two pictures, and often the biblical history is very different in that we sort of see Nebuchadnezzar from a different light. So I'd like to first take a look at the secular history, and at some stage we'll intersect with biblical history and get a really full picture for what Nebuchadnezzar is like. So Nebuchadnezzar, shall I start here? Nebuchadnezzar, he was born in 634, as we see there. He was born to Nabopolassar, and he was born in a very interesting time of the Assyrian Empire. Now, I should have a 634 BC there. You go. There's, I suppose, an artistic impression of Nebuchadnezzar and his father, Nabopolassar. Now, Nabopolassar, in terms of history, was a nobody. He was important nobody, but he was a nobody. He served in the Assyrian Empire under a variety of kings. The last real strong king, Ashurbanipal, I'm sure I've said that incorrectly, but Ashurbanipal was the main king that Nabopolassar served under, and this was his empire, the Assyrian Empire. A very interesting part of the world in that since the dawn of time, really, it's been a very turbulent area. It covers, just to give you it covers modern day Iraq and Iran, Iraq more sort of this way, Turkey here, Syria about there, the Levant, Israel, and Egypt down there. So these are areas that even today we see very much in the news. Consequently, much of the fighting that's occurring at the moment is happening in the Assyrian Empire, if you want to listen to some media outlets, and that this is very much a similar area where a lot of the fighting is occurring. So this is the Assyrian Empire. It had been a force in the world since about 900 BC. So for 300 years, you have had Assyrian rule in your country. And this is the setting, this is the context in which young Nebuchadnezzar has been born into. So think 300 years of foreign rule. Babylon is here. There's the province of Babylonia. Babylon, more or less. I wish I'd chosen images that look very, very clear on a small laptop screen, aren't necessarily super clear on a large screen. The city of Babylon is in this little area here in Mesopotamia. Potamus, Potamia, meaning rivers. Meso, meaning in the middle of, in Greek. That's this area, this small area of Babylon. Nabopolassar was I suppose like a prince, or not really a prince, like one of the officials under the Assyrian king. And now he has had this son, Nebuchadnezzar, in 634. Now, 300 years. 300 years is perhaps a little bit difficult for Australians, and I say people generally from the southern hemisphere to conceptualize. 300 years. To say to someone, oh, my country's been, my country was taken over, and I've been living in a country that's not ruled by my people for the last 300 years. What happened 300 years ago in Australia? 300. We don't really have much. There's not much was happening. Even in South Africa, 300 years ago was just Vasco da Gama, I think in 652, circumnavigated southern Africa, and he was one of the first. But really, before then, there were no, I suppose there were Khoisan, the brown people, but white Africans, black Africans, there weren't many of them. There were none of them whatsoever. Really, it's only the northern hemisphere that has a good idea of 300 years of a country of your region belonging to another country. A good friend of mine, he's a Swede, a very patriotic Swede, Jonathan. He told me that, we were talking about Finland at some stage when I was at his house in Sweden, and he goes, oh yes, Finland. Finland's really just a part of Sweden. I said, but I'm sure it's not. And he goes, no, well, for the last 200 years or 250 years, it's been its own country, but that doesn't really count. Like, the last 700 years before that, it was part of Sweden. They all speak Swedish, and he gave me a whole lot of evidence for why it was actually part of Sweden. But it's 200 years. It's nothing in the. So I found that quite interesting. So let's to make it real for you. You're now a young person that has been born, let's say, 200 years ago, Napoleon, 1801, 1802. This is now Napoleon Bonaparte that was ravaging through Europe. Let's say he managed to make it to Australia, and we're born now under the rule of Napoleon, like under the rule of France. We don't want to be French. That's why we're in Australia. So you're born into this kind of country. You have an overlord. Then something interesting happens. 627. Now, I want you to remember this date, 627. This is the wrong pointer. 627 there. 627 is a very interesting year, and it's a very prolific year, both in scripture as well as in secular history. And we'll discover a little bit more about why it's important in secular history. In terms of biblical history. In secular history, this Assyrian king, Ashurbanipal, he died. And it's not just that he died, he set a specific minion of his, he set over Babylon and said, okay, well, I'm the king of everything, but I'm going to set you as king of Babylon. Now, two things happened. One bad thing happened to both of them, and that was death. So Ashurbanipal died, as well as his little minion that he sent to rule over Babylon. So both of them have died, and they've left a rather weak king and rather weak heirs to the throne. So suddenly you've got a very interesting situation. You've got an old despot, an old king that has passed away and left a power vacuum. This is reading very much like most of the Middle East's history of the last 10 years as well. Old despot has passed away. The previous beta dogs are now trying to fight for position for alpha. It's exactly what's happening at the moment, which is quite interesting. So, this has happened. Nabopolassar, a nobody, he decides, I have my chance. After 300 years of Assyrian rule, I can break free. And so in 627, he just does that. But because he's a nobody and his people aren't really that strong, it's not, we sort of, from the biblical perspective, we have an idea of, we sort of get into the picture where Babylon's already a strong, mighty nation. At this point in 627, they're still a minnow, swimming among barracudas, large fish. To give you an idea of, let me get back to, I should have had another timeline. Okay, so to give you just to backtrack a little bit, this is we're talking about Nebuchadnezzar, Nabopolassar, to give you an idea of where this sits in terms of secular history as well as biblical history. 931, around about the time of Solomon's death and the splitting of the kingdom, we have the fall, so the Assyrian conquest, really the golden era of the Assyrian Empire was 722. They're conquering a whole lot of the Levant, a whole lot of Israel, that region. Here, the mid-600s is when we have Nebuchadnezzar coming onto the scene, and then 200 years later, we've got the story of Esther and King Ahasuerus, as well as I suppose, their battle with the Spartans, and that's sort of where the secular history comes in. But this is just sort of give us a picture of where we sit in terms of world history as well as biblical history. All right. So, we've got Nebuchadnezzar, the death and defection. So this is where the Assyrian king has died, leaving a power vacuum, and suddenly we've got people struggling. You're 7 years old. Your dad has decided to declare war on America. You're not sure how you feel about it. You're perhaps a little bit nervous. This is the equivalent of really about Australia declaring war on America, in that it is a smaller country. It's been subjugated, not in the same way Australia has, but population-wise at least. It is not America in terms of military might. Now, you've got a couple of years. You've got many years that it seems like Babylon is losing the struggle. It's a fierce struggle, but it seems to be going Assyria's way. It seems like they're going to be taking over. And then you've got a switching point. You've got a point where Nabopolassar manages to strike a deal with the Medes and the Persians and a variety of the Scythians and a variety of the other nations in the area. If I can get back to my map, if I keep pressing forward and wanting to go back, it makes all right, so we've got the Scythians in this area here, the Medes, the Persians here in Elam, the Babylonians. The head of the Assyrian Empire, essentially their seat of control, the zone of control is in this region here. Suddenly you've got Nabopolassar. He's managed to strike up a deal with the rest of the tribes in the area, the nations in the area, and they unite and they fight together as one to try conquering the Assyrian overlord. And things are still fierce, but it seems to be going, at least in Babylon and the coalition's favor. So much so that in 612 we have, or in 607 rather, we've got Nabopolassar that decides to give the reins of their army to Nebuchadnezzar. 607 he goes, here you go. What makes that? So he was 23 in 612, so it is 20 years old, 19 years old. Here, you're the general. So Nebuchadnezzar becomes the general of the army in 607. And the ancient sources say he proved himself as a man, an energetic strategist, an intelligent, energetic general. And essentially from then onwards, up until about 612, his campaign changed the tide of the war in the sense that he took reins. A young, vibrant man, young, vibrant general, he led his troops, and in 612 they sacked Nineveh. Now, Nineveh, that's the capital. And this is a big moment for the minnows. This is a big moment for the underlings, the underdogs, in that finally we've managed to plant our flag in the capital. So what happens is I get back to our map. All right, there we go. So we've got a march across, and here's Nineveh, the sacking of Nineveh, 612. They move their capital to Haran. Now, I can't see Haran here. It's a little bit further towards the coast. I'm going to put my dot there because I can't see it. Haran is a little bit further away from Babylon. As you can imagine why you'd want to move your capital a little bit further away. Haran. Now, we heard we've experienced Haran before, in that we've had some patriarchs pass through there before, but that's not really the point of this story. They sack Haran, the coalition. Nebuchadnezzar, as part of the coalition, they sack Haran, and then they move the capital. The Assyrians move the capital to Carchemish, that is right there. Now, Carchemish hopefully tinkles a little bit of a subconscious light in the back of your mind. Carchemish, you think Carchemish. Now, this is the definitive battle in the struggle, the Assyrians against the Babylonians. You've got Nebuchadnezzar. He's on the way up. He looks like things are going well. Finally, he's managed to turn the Assyrians back. The Assyrians have asked a few years before, they've asked for the help of the Egyptians. The Egyptians, their pharaoh at the time was Necho. Necho, to get to Carchemish and to help the Babylonians, he would travel from Egypt through the Levant, through Judea, to get to Carchemish. And this is where we jump into our biblical history. So if you'd like to turn to actually no, before I do that. So Jeremiah 25. If you'd like to turn to Jeremiah 25 verse 1 to 3, Jeremiah 25 verse 1 to 3. Jeremiah 25, verse 1 to 3. And it says, the word that came to Jeremiah concerning all the people of Judah in the 4th year of Jehoiakim the son of Josiah, king of Judah, which was the first year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. The first year. Now, this battle that occurred at Carchemish, this was in 605. Around about 605, 604 is when Nabopolassar died, and Nebuchadnezzar assumed the throne of Babylon. So we've got Jeremiah's call. Jeremiah, it says here, we've got the call starting in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, which was the first year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. So we're talking about 605. 605 in the 4th year. The word. All right. So. All right, if I'd like you to skip down to verse 3. From the 13th year of Josiah, the son of Ammon, king of Judah, even to this day, this is the 23rd year in which the word of the Lord has come to me. So this is Jeremiah speaking to the Israelites, or to the Judahites. From the 13th year of Josiah, this is the 23rd year in which the word of the Lord has spoken to me. 23 plus 5, quick maths lesson for someone who is not that fantastic at maths. 23 plus 5 gives us 28. So we're not really sure if it's 205, 206. So we're talking about 627, 628 BC. What did I say was prolific about 627, 628 BC? Oh, wrong way. Do you remember what happened in 627? It's interesting. That's the death of the Assyrian king. So it's very interesting. On a world stage, we read the Bible and we think, oh, well, it started 627. As a historian, an ancient historian, you start tingling. That's interesting. Jeremiah starts his call to the Israelites saying, repent and listen to God, the same year that the old Assyrian king dies. And it's interesting as well, in that further on in the passage, So thus says the Lord. So verse 8, he says, "Therefore, thus says the Lord of hosts, because you have not heard my words, behold, I will send and take all the families of the north, says the Lord, and Nebuchadnezzar the king of Babylon, my servant, and I will bring them against this land, against its inhabitants." Now, did he say that in 605 for the first time, or was he saying that for the last however many years? I don't know. It's quite interesting, though, that this prediction had to have occurred prior to the Battle of Carchemish, and likely, perhaps, it has been going since 627. But that's just speculation, really, on my side. So, we've got Jeremiah, and that's now like our little detour. Back on the main road, we have 2 Chronicles 35 that I'd like you to turn to. 2 Chronicles 35. And we've followed now Nebuchadnezzar's story. Nebuchadnezzar, a young general that's risen to power, and he's on the cusp of fighting his definitive battle, cutting his teeth, if you like, finally perhaps shaking off the Assyrian overlord. And this is where as I said, this is where the biblical history comes in 2 Chronicles 35, verse 20 to 24. We've got, "After all this, when Josiah had prepared the temple," so to give you a bit of a context as well of this beforehand, Josiah is keeping the Passover, is, I suppose, going through the Passover process, which is prolific for us today because it is the first day of the first light day of Passover. Passover actually started last night in the evening. So interesting, relevant for us as well today, serendipitously. So, we've got Josiah keeping the Passover. Shortly after Passover, likely, after this, when Josiah had prepared the temple, Necho, king of Egypt, came up to fight against Carchemish. Ooh, we've heard Carchemish before. By the Euphrates, and Josiah went out against him. But he sent messengers, I'm on verse 21 of chapter 35, but he sent messengers to him saying, "What have I to do with you, king of Judah? I have not come against you this day, but against the house with which I have war. For God commanded me to make haste, refrain from meddling with God who is with me, lest he destroy you." Nevertheless, Josiah would not turn his face from him, but disguised himself so that he would not fight, so that he might fight him, and did not heed the words of Necho from the mouth of God. That's interesting. So he did not heed the words of Necho from the mouth of God. And it's interesting if we take a look at that map as well. Come, Charl, point the thing the other way. So essentially we had Josiah. He was trying to choose sides in a conflict that he should have stayed neutral in. And he was trying to, so strategically it was interesting in that he was trying to block Necho's passage from Egypt up to Carchemish. And Judah not being really the strongest of nations at all at that time, he was sort of wiped aside. And Necho continued on to Carchemish, where Nebuchadnezzar and the coalition forces finally defeated the Assyrians. And Nebuchadnezzar was crowned king. So this 605, 607, 604 is the first year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, as well as this definitive moment really in his life, in his young life. So at this stage, Nebuchadnezzar Battle of Carchemish is 30. He's crowned king around about when he's 30 and 31. What is the image that we're now seeing of Nebuchadnezzar? Who is Nebuchadnezzar? What kind of picture do we get a look? A young man that has achieved through striving. It hasn't just been handed to him on a silver platter. He's grown up in war. His house, he's gone from underdog, from no-name father, to struggling kingdom, struggling for independence, to finally the lead general of the army and king of Babylon. And he has been involved with the placing of Babylon, the placing of his kingdom to the pinnacle. So it's a life of strife. Up until 30, it's been a life of strife. So try putting yourself in that perspective now as we kind of get in the mind or get in the life of Nebuchadnezzar. So that is, we've just read 20 to 24. So 36, just like to move a little bit forward. So chapter 36, verse 5 to 8. So Jehoiakim was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord his God. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up against him, bound him in bronze fetters to carry him off to Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar also carried off some articles from the house of the Lord to Babylon, and put them in his temple at Babylon. Now the rest of the acts of Jehoiakim, the abominations, and it continues like that. So we've got there. This is the first captivity, if you like, of the Judeans, where Nebuchadnezzar has come in, and it's the first wave of captives that he takes. Now I'd like you to turn to Daniel. Daniel chapter 1, verse 1 and 6. Daniel chapter 1, verse 1 to 6. And it says, in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hands with some articles of the house of the Lord, so on. Verse 3, Then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge and quick to understand, who had ability to serve in the king's palace, whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed for them a daily provision of the king's delicacies and of the wine which he drank, and 3 years of training for them. Now, in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, this places it 605, 604. 605, 604. Around about then that Daniel was taken into captivity. And it's interesting there as well, just as a little detour, side note, that little last section of verse 4, it says, and whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans. Nebuchadnezzar and his father, the moment they broke away from the Assyrian Empire, they were quite traditionalists. They were unusual in that they had this love for the Akkadian language. Now, Akkadian was a very old language already by that stage. It was the traditional language of the Chaldeans, their people, Nebuchadnezzar's people, but it had already become antiquated. Was the present continuous, past perfect? I can't remember. It had already become antique by the time they came to the throne. So in much the same way that modern Hebrew had to be resurrected by just a very small amount of people, I think there's one chap that coined a couple of thousand words in the modern Hebrew language based off root words. So it had to be resurrected. In the same way, Hebrew really wasn't a spoken word, spoken language for many, many hundreds of years, other than in religion. Akkadian was the same when Nebuchadnezzar and those guys came, in that they came to the throne and they had to revive the Akkadian language. They also had to coin many of the words in much of the way that modern Hebrew had to be. So that's just an aside. And it's quite interesting as well that the Akkadian was quite difficult. So you can imagine that they needed to get some of the smarter guys that could actually hack through this ancient language. But that's a detour. Now back on track. So 605, 604, round about there is when Daniel was taken into captivity, as well as his friends. Now, this is where the story heats up and gets a little bit interesting. A lot of people break up the book of Daniel into prophetic and historical. My way of looking at it, and I don't know, it might be completely theologically incorrect, the way I've come to see the book of Daniel, at least the first four chapters of Daniel, it's broken up into the four major experiences that, or the four major prompts, if you like, that God used or tried speaking to Nebuchadnezzar. So the first four chapters, in a way, you can actually break up as the first four experiences that Nebuchadnezzar had with God, with the God of Israel. So if we take a look at the beginning of chapter 1, it says in the third, so it's like so chapter 1, verse 1. So it sets just the date, and it says in the third year of the reign of King Jehoiakim of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar. So our first real, functional word, their functional noun is Nebuchadnezzar. Chapter 2, we have now in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Nebuchadnezzar. Chapter 3, we've got Nebuchadnezzar the king. Chapter 4, we've got Nebuchadnezzar the king. So it's interesting in that the first 4 books of Daniel deal with God's revealing himself to Nebuchadnezzar, which I found interesting. I'd never really thought of it in that way before. Now, the first way that, and this is sort of the crux of what I want to get along, I want to take a look at how God reveals himself to Nebuchadnezzar, and how he works in his life, and how Nebuchadnezzar kind of deals with this new god that's supposedly subservient to his gods. And what I completely actually forgot to say on this Nebuchadnezzar's ascension to the throne. So he's taken Daniel. They've gone back to Babylon. At the crowning ceremony, so Nebuchadnezzar is given the crown, his father's crown, and he says this, of all things, that you would say, "O merciful Marduk, may the house that I have built endure forever. May I be satiated with its splendor, attain old age therein with abundant offspring, and receive therein tribute of all the kings of all regions from all mankind." So he wants glory and power. But it's interesting that the first statement says, "O merciful Marduk, may the house that I've built endure forever. May my kingdom be eternal." It's interesting. So this is his inauguration speech. He has the crown on his head. He looks to Marduk and says, "May my kingdom last forever." And this is interesting. This is 605. This is 605. BC. Now, who is Marduk? Now, Marduk is perhaps one of the most controversial, well-studied but controversial, pseudo-gods in history. Lots of different scholars have different ideas. I've just popped down some of the main ones that come from the most reputable sources. Marduk, it may be Amar-Utu, like I suppose a dirty or like a bad pronunciation of Amar-Utu, meaning the son of Utu or the calf of the sun. Now, who is Utu? That doesn't really make much sense. We'll talk a little bit more about him in a tick. So Marduk, he sort of has these 3 kind of main names: Amar-Utu, son of Utu, Amar meaning son. He's often identified, which came across interesting in a lot of the sources, he came across as the god of storms. So as a result, he's often portrayed with these lightning bolts. And actually in this picture, he's fighting one of the other gods for possession of, I think this is the god Tiamat that he kills to make earth with her body, or the sea with her body, or something delightful for a Sabbath. So this is now storms, lightning, radiance. It's interesting, just a side note. Now, Utu as well, just purely for the sake of being fussy, Utu was an older god. Because often in paganism they'll say, "Oh, I kind of like the idea of that god. Yeah, he speaks to me on some kind of primal level. I'll adopt him and he can be my god, and I'll worship him and give him half of all I own and whatnot." Marduk was now in one stream of thinking they're the son of Utu. Who is Utu? Utu was the sun god. So the 2nd millennium Sumerian hymn to Utu, and it's an interesting read actually if you're sleepy or you'd like a nice nightmare. It describes the sun god's shining appearance and powers of judgment by saying that his radiance spreads out like a net over the world. So you've got the sun god that has this radiant kind of figure, and his son that is also a god of storms and lightning and thunder and a variety of things. So just as a side note. Now, that's our detour. Back on the main road, we've got Daniel chapter 1. Daniel chapter 1, so I already read here and the king appointed them for a daily provision of the king's delicacies and of the wine which he drank. It continues on to verse 18, so chapter 1, verse 18. "Now at the end of the days, when the king had said that they should be brought in," so this is all the young men that were being trained, "the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. The king himself, the king interviewed them, and among them none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they served before the king, and in all matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in his realm. Thus Daniel continued until the 1st year of King Cyrus." Now, it's interesting. So the first exposure that Nebuchadnezzar has to God and God's ways are these unusual young men that have only eaten vegetables and water. What an unusual combination. It's interesting, I read at some stage in a history book that the first settlers to America looked upon the Indians with kind of like a weird look because, they drank water. But why would you drink water if you have beer? They were perplexed as to why the Indians ate vegetables and drank water. That's for cattle, that's not for humans, it's meat and beer. And I very much look at this in the same way. You've got these three young men that look vibrant. They're sharp, they're on the ball. And so much so that they stand out above all the others. And they've got this unusual diet and some sort of mumbling about, not, eating my kind of food and, some religious kind of thing. I can imagine Nebuchadnezzar going, oh, that's kind of interesting. So this is sort of the first kind of pinprick of God saying, hey, listen, anyway, we'll leave that alone for now. We've talked about that. So this is his kingdom at the moment. The Medes here, they're really underlings to his kingdom. The Persians as well, at the time of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. The Medes, the Persians, a lot of the Anatolian Peninsula, this peninsula of Turkey, they were all subservient to Nebuchadnezzar. There was still Egypt that was putting up a bit of a fuss, but Egypt really wasn't a major, it was a worry, but not such a huge worry in the sense that Nebuchadnezzar was definitely the most powerful dog on the block at this stage. Now, we saw from Daniel 1 that their training finished in 603. So their training would have finished about 602, 603. Let's go to chapter 2, verse 1. Now in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. In the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, he had dreams. So Daniel was likely taken about 605. Nebuchadnezzar was likely crowned officially, because I think, if I can remember, it sort of happened towards the end of the year, although I'm a little bit hazy. So 605, Daniel, we've got 3 years, so the 605, 605, 604, 603, 602. We've got Daniel and his friends finishing their training. As well, it says here in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar, so around about that same time, 602, 603, we've got Nebuchadnezzar having dreams. And historically, this is very prolific. It's interesting how often in the Bible and in history in general, kings have dreams when they're troubled. In 601, so just a year after these dreams occurred, he attacked Egypt, and it was a major attack, a major conquest. So here, Nebuchadnezzar was planning for an attack. So it's a very turbulent time, and he has this dream. And it's interesting as well, Ahasuerus, as well as... no, we'll leave that alone, otherwise we're going to spend way too much time on detours and not enough on the actual thing. So, chapter 2, we've got in the second year, so we've already said that's around about the same time. It goes through to this. It goes through this story. Verse 4, it says. Well, no, I'll continue reading just from chapter 2, verse 2. Then the king gave the command to call the magicians, the astrologers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans to the king. To tell the king his dreams. So they came and stood before the king, and the king said to them, I have had a dream, and my spirit is anxious to know the dream. So you're called into, at this stage, one of the mightiest men, if not the mightiest man on the planet. And it said, I had a pretty disturbing dream, and I want to know what it said. Cool. And so the answer, which is interesting, the answer in Aramaic, which is interesting as well. The Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream and we'll give the interpretation. And we know the story. Nebuchadnezzar says, I'm on to you. You tell me the dream and its interpretation so that I know why I'm paying you such a good salary and keeping you alive. And they answer as well. They answer afterwards and say, there is not a man, so this is verse 10, there is not a man on earth who can tell the king this matter. There is no magicians, no anyone. It's impossible. Verse 12, for this reason the king was angry and very furious and gave command to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. Now this is the next bit, is the bit I sometimes miss when I'm listening to the vegetarian, low-fat version of the Bible. the Uncle Arthur doesn't regularly sort of specify this. So the decree went out, and they began killing the wise men. And they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them also. So sometimes we say, oh, there was this decree, and he said, oh, I'm very angry with you. I'm going to kill you. Oh, okay. Like he actually started killing the magicians. He actually started killing the wise men. And he actively sought Daniel and his friends, which I find is just an interesting detail to the story. So we've got further on. It says there, from verse 14 onwards, then with counsel and wisdom Daniel answered Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. He answered and said to Arioch, the king's captain, why is the decree from the king so urgent? Then Arioch made the decision known to Daniel. So Daniel went in and asked the king to give him time. It's a pretty natural kind of sentence, but if someone's trying to kill me, I wouldn't just go into them and say, like, it's not like you just walk in like, oh, there's Nebuchadnezzar, I'll quickly, hey, look, Nebuchadnezzar, I know you're trying to kill me, but like, there's a lot of steps that you'll need to take before you have physical access to the king. It kind of reminds me a lot of Esther, that she wouldn't have just like waltzed into, the king, hey, king, like, there are steps. Because the king needs to be secure. There's rigmarole. You need to talk to this guy, to talk to that guy, to talk to that guy, to whisper in the king's ear to say, okay, well, I'll let him through. Now, with Daniel, it doesn't say it. I would guess it would be very much the same. You've got now this guy that said, I want you to kill, and they're actually searching for me to kill me, and I've gone and go, oh, hello, I'm here, but I want to tell him something. I don't want you to kill me first. So very interesting. Anyway, we'll move on. So it says, Daniel went to the king and he asked the king to give him time that he might give the king the interpretation. So if we turn over, we know the rest of the story. Daniel prays and he reveals the dream, and he reveals the dream to. In verse 20, he says there, verse 19, then the secret was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. So Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Daniel answered and said, blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for the wisdom and might are his. And he goes through and he gives his blessing and he blesses God. Interesting concept as well, that we can bless God, which is, I suppose, another sermon in that what the word blessing means, but that's for another day. Therefore Daniel, so verse 24, therefore Daniel went to Arioch and said, I know I've been revealed the dream. And so this, the rest of the passage, I won't go through it because I'm aware of the time. The rest of the passage goes through the statue and the head of gold and the different metals that make up the rest of the body. And it's interesting that it's almost an indication to Nebuchadnezzar, even though you're the head, this house that you want to have that lasts forever, it's good at the moment, and it's made of gold at the moment, but it's not going to last forever, which is interesting. This is now the message, and we know what Nebuchadnezzar said at his inaugural speech, and it's interesting that Daniel now reveals this to him. So what does Nebuchadnezzar have to say to this? So he's been perplexed, and he started killing some of his counselors. And then suddenly there's this young man that comes up to him, one of the captives that he's got from Israel, or from Judah rather at this stage. And yeah, isn't this young chap that stood out? He's quite smart, he ate vegetables and drank water or something. And now he comes to me and he tells me what my dream is, he tells me the interpretation. That's interesting, that's prolific. What does Nebuchadnezzar say? So this is his second experience. So first experience, this is his second experience. Listen to what Nebuchadnezzar says. Then Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face prostrate before Daniel and commanded that they should present an offering and incense to him, treating him as a god in the sense. So the king answered Daniel and said, truly your God is the God of gods, the Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, since you could reveal this secret. Then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many great gifts, and he made him ruler of the whole province of Babylon and chief administrator over all the wise men of Babylon. And Daniel petitioned the king, and he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, there's his friends, just with their Babylonian names, Akkadian names, over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel sat in the gate of the king. So Daniel was still the eminent counselor. So we've got our first experience that God has sort of spoken as like a God of, it's interesting, a God of health perhaps. Now the second one is a bit more prolific. It's the revealer of secrets, the God of gods, the Lord of lords, a revealer of secrets. It's interesting, he doesn't say, there is just one God. He says, you're the God of all the gods. It seems like you're the most powerful God of all the gods that I serve. We'll move on. So, a little bit more of the backstory, if you like. If we return to 2 Chronicles 35 again. So, we've read, 36, so 2 Chronicles 36. We've read from verse 5 to 8 already that Daniel and his friends were taken in the first captivity. And we'll read now from verse 9 onwards. Jehoiakim was 8 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 3 years and 10 days, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord. At the turn of the year, so this is 597, so at the turn of the year, King Nebuchadnezzar summoned him and took him to Babylon with the costly articles from the house of the Lord, and made Zedekiah, Jehoiakim's brother, king over Judah and Jerusalem. So this is 597. He's taken this guy away, and he's instituted Zedekiah as the new king of Judah. Now, the backstory in terms of the history, in 601, I told you that just before his dream of the statue, Nebuchadnezzar was preparing for his conquest. He actually attacked Egypt in 601, and it wasn't really a success. So, hang on. It seems like the golden bull, it seems like Nebuchadnezzar the mighty has been stalled. He's managed to throw off Assyria. He's managed to come to the top of the dog pile, if you like. The Hefe, the leader, the in-charge man. But he's stalled. He's attacked Egypt, and he hasn't managed to get any further. And this is quite interesting. So this happened 601. 597 is his second captivity. Just as a point of interest, you can take a look in Ezekiel that in 592, so we're now looking, come now. So here we go. We've got 597 is the attack on Judah, 597, and that's when he takes the second round of captives, Ezekiel included, and it's also when round about then that Ezekiel's prophecies, the word started coming to Ezekiel from God. His visions start in 592, so a few years after 597. Now, this is where it gets super interesting as well. So, 601, failed attempt on Egypt. 597, he takes Judah. Now, what's interesting is that history tells us is that things started getting a little bit hot for Nebuchadnezzar. He's stalled in his onslaught of Egypt. 594, there's interesting because in the Chronicles of Nebuchadnezzar, he mentions that there's a rebellion in about the 595, 594 period. There's a rebellion. And he actually has to quell this rebellion violently. Which may not mean much at the moment, but we'll take a look now why that's interesting. So that's 594. Remember that date, 594. I don't think I put it up here. 594 and 590, around about that same time, we've got letters from the Medes, that country that's just to the north. They're the vassals, so they're the servants, if you like, they're the underlings of Nebuchadnezzar. It seems like they're sort of getting a little bit restless as well. So you've got a rebellion that's occurring at the same time and that is squished. You've got now the Medes that are getting restless. A variety of things that are occurring at a similar time. And obviously there was a king in Judah that he didn't like either, and now he's put Zedekiah in. Now, Daniel 3, I've got here Daniel 3. Why do I want you to turn to Daniel 3 first? All right, let's go to Daniel 3. I can't remember why I wanted you to turn there first, but we shall turn there. And it'll fall together, hopefully. All right. Daniel 3. So, Nebuchadnezzar, so Daniel 3, chapter 1, remember? Nebuchadnezzar. So it's our third chapter, our third experience, our third revealing of God, or God revealing himself to Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar the king, verse 1, made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and its width 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. And King Nebuchadnezzar sent word to gather together the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image of which Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So he called everyone. Who did he just set up? In 597, he took the old king off, the boy king who was being evil, and he put who in power? He put Zedekiah into power. So he's now called all the governors of all the provinces to come bow before the idol. What specifically does he ask them to do? We know the story. He says there, to you it is commanded, O peoples, this is verse 4, then a herald cried aloud, to you it is commanded, O peoples, nations and languages, that at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre and psaltery, in symphony with all kinds of music, you shall fall down and worship the king. Now, in the Bible, we're not told when this is. So Nebuchadnezzar sets up a statue, it's all gold. That's interesting. It's interesting in that, he's had this desire from his inauguration for his kingdom to last forever. And Daniel has told him this dream that you will last and you'll be rich, but it's not going to last forever. And now he's had these rebellions, he's stalled against Egypt. And what does he do? Well, obviously you're feeling a little bit insecure, so I'm going to make a giant gold statue and make everyone bow down to it. So this is an oath of fealty. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that this golden statue occurred around about this 594 period. 594. Now, why do I pull that date out of the blue, out of my hat? Turn to Jeremiah 51, verse 59. I know we're jumping around, but I find it interesting. And, well, that's not an excuse. It's an explanation for us jumping around. So Jeremiah 51, verse 59, not a usual part of the Bible that personally I have to admit I don't regularly read this part of the Bible, but obviously I should. So Jeremiah 51, verse 59, then the word which Jeremiah the prophet commanded Seraiah, the son of Neriah, the son of Mashiach, when he went to Zedekiah the king of Judah when he went with Zedekiah the king of Judah to Babylon in the 4th year of his reign. We're now talking 593, aren't we? The 4th year of his reign. That's interesting. The Bible doesn't actually tell us why Zedekiah went. He just says in 593 Zedekiah had to go to Babylon. Doesn't say why. He just goes. Now, and this is sort of something that some of the scholars have suggested, that the rebellion that occurred in 593, 594, the fact that Zedekiah had to leave for some unknown reason to Babylon, I mean, he had to go from Judah to Babylon, specifically to Babylon, him being a king, he has to... So a couple of these events have occurring at the same time, and the fact that this golden statue required everyone to bow down and swear fealty, swear allegiance to Nebuchadnezzar, suggests that the golden statue situation occurred here in about 594, 593, which is interesting as well, because who were the only three that actually didn't bow down? Yes, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which means which king of Israel would have had to bow down? Or king of Judah at this stage. It was interesting. Sort of by direct implication, we kind of get the idea that Zedekiah actually bowed down to the golden idol, in that the evidence suggests that he was actually there at the site. Interesting. So what happens now? I know we're running. I'm almost done. So we've got the situation where in Daniel, his friends they refuse to bow. Actually, we need to quickly turn to it. This is one of the major sections of Nebuchadnezzar's. So we have in verse in verse 8 of chapter 3, so Daniel 3 verse 8, it says, "Therefore at that time certain Chaldeans came forward and accused the Jews. They spoke and said to King Nebuchadnezzar, 'O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that everyone should bow down, and whoever does not bow down will be subject to judgment, to be cast in the midst of the burning fiery furnace.'" Verse 12, "There are certain Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. 3 men, O king, you have paid due, you have commanded to pay due to you. They did not bow down, and the king was in a rage, and he commanded them to be sent to be thrown in the furnace." And what happens? We know the story. They're thrown in the furnace, and it says here, where am I going to skip to? So let's say verse. All right, so verse 24. "Then King Nebuchadnezzar," so chapter 3, verse 24, "Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished, and he rose in haste and spoke, saying to his counselors, 'Did we not cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire?' They answered and said to the king, 'True, O king, we did.' 'Look,' he answered, 'I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the form of the 4th is like the Son of God.'" Now, we've got in our Christian Bibles, we've got that in capitals, and I think it's a little bit sort of circular because Nebuchadnezzar wouldn't have had an intimate knowledge of Jesus as the Son of God. And for that matter, neither did Daniel. So what does this mean? It's interesting. He says, "Oh, like the Son of God." I don't know. This is just sort of my speculation. It's interesting that both Marduk and Utu, the 2 deities that he might have actually served, were both involved with the radiant displays of light. But that's just speculation. I just found that interesting. So, what does Nebuchadnezzar say when he realizes that these men have been spared? And it's interesting that Utu, or at least these deities, they're often involved with judgment of unrighteousness and unfealty and a variety of things. So it's interesting that God has proved himself in the second one. God has proved himself as powerful, and Nebuchadnezzar sort of sees him as just like the head of all the gods. In this 3rd chapter, what does Nebuchadnezzar say? He says, he realizes that these men have been saved, and he says, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him. And they have frustrated the king's word and yielded their bodies that they should not serve nor worship any god except their own. Therefore I make a decree that any people, nation, or language which speaks anything amiss against the God of the Judeans shall be cut into pieces. Their houses shall be made an ash heap, because there is no other God who can deliver like this." So he's the God of deliverance. So this 3rd experience is an all-powerful God of deliverance. It's interesting. Now, stay with me. We're not far from the finish line. We fast forward a few years, and we've got Nebuchadnezzar that's coming back on top. We've got a revolt. He's quelling some of the revolts. The final revolt, if you like, happens in before 586, and this is where he comes and he sacks Jerusalem. Jerusalem falls and he takes over. Now, what happened slightly before this? And this is where we turn to Jeremiah. This is where we turn to Jeremiah. So Jeremiah 39. If I can quickly grab that. Jeremiah 39. Stay with me. I know it's a little bit late, but I'll finish soon and we can feast on this fantastic Sabbath day. I always find it when I'm sitting on a Sabbath afternoon and my belly's very full and I want to feel a little bit guilty for eating so much and chatting so much, then I remember the passage in Leviticus that it's this small segment, this paragraph that lists the Sabbath as the first of the feast days, and then I feel happy that I ate so much and I talked so much. All right. So, Jeremiah 39, verse 5 to 7. Jeremiah 39, verse 5 to 7. It says here, "But the Chaldean army pursued them." This is after the fall of Jerusalem. The Chaldean army pursued the Israelites, so the Judeans rather, and overtook Zedekiah in the plains of Jericho. And when they had captured him, they brought him up to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Whoa. So you have a man that just 10 years prior has bowed in oath to the man that set him on the throne. And here you have then the king of Babylon killed the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes in Riblah. The king of Babylon also killed all the nobles of Judah. Moreover, he put out Zedekiah's eyes and bound him with bronze fetters and carried him off to Babylon. So we've got quite a vicious picture of Nebuchadnezzar so far. Now, in what's happened previously, and this is the story of Jeremiah, in that he's warned the people of Judah. He's warned Zedekiah and said, listen to God, listen to God, listen to God. And you've had false prophets and accusers and liars and deceivers that have said, no, in 2 years' time we'll break the yoke of Babylon. And Jeremiah's going, this is not true, this is false. And bless you. And so what do they do to this man of God? They pop him in prison. They put him in prison. And here in verse 39 in chapter 11, we now have the intersection of Nebuchadnezzar and Jeremiah. Now, verse 11, now Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, gave charge concerning Jeremiah to Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, saying, take him, and so this is Nebuchadnezzar talking, take him, so take Jeremiah and look after Jeremiah, and do Jeremiah no harm, but do to him just as he says to you to do. That's interesting. So Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, sent Nebuchadnezzar, Rabsaris, Nergal, Sharezer, Rabmag. Now, yeah, I could go into lots of detail, but I won't. So this is interesting, in that he's specifically given his captains, his princes, a direct directive, and said, Jeremiah, look after him, do what he tells you to do. And this is a very interesting part of the conversation where later on, so this is verse, so that's 11 to 12. So if we flip over to 40, I'll quickly just read it for you. 40, verse 2 and 3, the word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord after Nebuzaradan, come now. Okay, so, and the captain of the guard that took Jeremiah said, the Lord your God has pronounced this doom on this place. That's interesting. Often we have a very skewed picture. We're kind of like with Habakkuk, and that's my challenge to you guys, to read Habakkuk afterwards. We've got this idea of Habakkuk that we've followed God's people now from Adam, from Abraham, and after Abraham, and especially with Israel, they've now become, well, Isaac, Israel, they've now become God's people. So we follow the story of God's people. We kind of sometimes miss that they started walking way over here. And they're not necessarily all good. And so we get people like Necho, we get people like Nebuzaradan, which is a historical figure, by the way. It's interesting, Nebuzaradan's actually mentioned in some of the ledgers, but that's also more detail that's going to make us even hungrier. This is something that, now I'm getting hungry because I'm losing my mind. This is something interesting in that you've got a Gentile, a Goy, one of the Goyim, that's now telling Jeremiah, the Lord God has pronounced doom on this place. Now the Lord has brought it and has done just as he has said, because you people have sinned against the Lord and not obeyed his voice. Therefore this thing has come upon you. So for Jeremiah, it's vindication. What a sweet word, vindication. Suddenly, everything that he has said, he's been proved now that he was a true prophet of God. So, there's another whole sermon in vindication of Jeremiah and whatnot. We'll leave that alone for another day. I think this is evidence, personally, I think this is perhaps evidence of Daniel's effect and even Jeremiah's effect, because Jeremiah sent this servant of his, Seraiah, to go to Babylon with Zedekiah. So I think this is evidence of the Lord's working of both through Jeremiah and Daniel in the court of Babylon, in that Nebuchadnezzar has a clear indication of who Jeremiah is. Interesting. All right, now, finally, in 570, we've got the collapse of 570. We've got the 570 around about here. We've got the collapse of Egypt, and so now the top dog is Babylon, uncontested. And this is where Daniel chapter 4, and our final section on Daniel chapter 4 comes in. So home straight, stay with me. Final couple of sentences, and then we'll take some themes from it and some challenges and go feast on this lovely feast day. So Nebuchadnezzar, this is now his second dream. So he has this dream, and Daniel comes again. He has this dream, this confusing, disturbing dream. And Daniel comes and tells him, but king, you're proud. You haven't listened to your other experiences with God. You haven't listened to God's prompting in your life. You've said, I'm a self-made man. I cast off the Assyrians. I defeated the rebels. I have defeated Egypt. You haven't placed the credit where credit is due. And as a result, you will, and this is where sort of the title of my sermon was Crown on the Brow and Dew on the Back, in that he wandered the earth as an animal for 7 years, and it specifically says there, and there's one sentence, that he had the dew on his back for 7 years, which is interesting because that's something that historically as well is mentioned as happening. So we've got sort of secular history and biblical history crossing over again. And it's interesting that this whole chapter 4 actually, I said I probably spoke incorrectly before, and that I said Daniel wrote it. I hope I didn't say that. This reads as a letter from Nebuchadnezzar. So it says, Nebuchadnezzar the king, to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be upon you. Peace be multiplied to you. I thought it, and so he goes on, and I thought it good to declare the signs and wonders that the Most High God has worked for me. Wow. He continues on in chapter 4, verse 34, a little bit away. I bless the Most High and pray. So this is after his bout of lunacy, where he's finally become humble. He said, I bless the Most High and praised and honored him who lives forever, for his dominion is everlasting, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. At the same time, my reason returned to me, and for the glory of my kingdom and my honor and my splendor returned to me. My counselors and my nobles resorted to me. I was restored to my kingdom, and excellent majesty was added to me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all his works, and then it continues on. So it's interesting, his fourth experience with God, God spoke to him perhaps very subtly through these young men and their healthy lifestyle. His second experience was he spoke to him through the revealing of very prolific secrets and mysteries through dreams. The third experience, if that wasn't enough, was that you've thrown these guys in the fire and I've saved them. And then finally, well, you're still not listening at all, and so he's subjected to a bout of lunacy, craziness. He lost his mind, didn't know what was happening, until he found that one thing that mattered, and that was God, and that God was sovereign, not him. Now, those are our four experiences. What kind of themes do we get from this? And I've just popped down some themes, and this is sort of like the take-home message, so if you don't remember any of the details that I've been blabbering on for a while, you can remember this at least. Some of the themes that we can pick out from this Nebuchadnezzar story, that was, in Judah's hour of most want, there was perhaps the most multitude of counselors. So in the hour of most of Judah's need, there was the most amount of counselors. How many do you have? All contemporaries: Habakkuk, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel. Not to mention the other smaller players like Sariyah and whatever else. So at the hour of most want, you've got the most amount of counselors. Nebuchadnezzar's path to God wasn't overnight. God revealed himself over years, and with more and more prompting. The first, second, and third revealings, Nebuchadnezzar seemed to pigeonhole God into attributes of a specific type of God, rather than the one monotheistic, all-powerful, omnipotent, omniscient God. He sort of said, oh, well, that's interesting. There's a God that, kind of makes his people healthy. That's interesting, yeah. Or, it's a God that reveals secrets. That's really cool. He's the God of all the gods. And then the third one is, oh, hang on. And the fourth one, especially, it was his God Most High. The third one is perhaps, he is God. And then the fourth one was, hang on, like I'm not God. He is actually above me. So it's interesting this journey this pathway that Nebuchadnezzar has walked in his discovery with God. Now, the final one of the themes, I suppose, that I picked out was that God was very much involved at a level of the kings. So you have a time here where a lot of the history was repeating itself. I could go on for another couple of hours, which I won't, about how this actually parallels the current situation in Syria and Iraq and Iran. So you've got history repeating itself, and you see in King Ahasuerus, you see in our King Nebuchadnezzar here that God puts multitude of counselors in the right place to influence those at the highest levels. So if God was doing that then, why wouldn't he be doing that now? In the face of conspiracy, in the face of the Illuminati subplot, or the Freemasons and their thing, or the so-and-sos and the this and that, or my boss that doesn't want to give me that, or politicians we prayed for before. In the face of all of this, we can have a calm assurance that God will put the right people in the right place, even at the highest levels of government, to help bring about righteousness, to help work for the good of the kingdom. All right, and my final challenge to you is this. How many prompts will it take for you to hear the voice of God and to hear his prompting, to accept him and what he's saying and the direction that he wants you to walk in your life? All right, I think it's pretty late. Let's just pray and finish, if that's all right with everyone. Cool. All right, bow your heads and we'll... Thank you, Lord, for guiding. Thank you for your guidance. Thank you for vindication, dear Lord. Thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for your righteousness. I'd like to bless your name, dear Lord, above all other names. Guide us all this week, dear Lord, that we may walk with your love, that we may catch the blessings that fall from your hand, dear Lord, and that we may walk with humble hearts, open eyes and open ears, that we may hear, see, and experience you for who you are, and die to ourselves every day. We ask all this in the name of the Lord. Amen.